My lord, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last Inner Temple Readers Lecture. I'm the reader, but don't worry, I'm not going to read anything to you. My only function this evening is to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Audrey Giles, who's next to me. I have been given a document listing Dr. Giles's achievements. Frankly, it's a stupendous piece of work. I should really read all of it out. It's got things in there which, to me, sound absolutely wonderful. And I think you're going to have a very wonderful time listening to Dr. Giles this evening. But by way of brief introduction, she was formerly the head of the questioned documents section of the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory, not something many people can say. When she stopped doing that, she set up her own independent lab. And the Giles Document Laboratory, as it's called, is equipped to the highest standards for forensic document examination. It has the most up-to-date kit for all necessary examinations. And here's a list of the sorts of things it's got. The latest in video spectral comparators and Raman spectrometry for ink examinations, electrostatic detection equipment for detecting impressions, and lots of other stuff like that, including image capture software to provide demonstration material for reports and courts. The laboratory is accredited to the internationally recognized quality standard. Dr. Giles has also attended many meetings in the UK, Europe, the United States, and South America, contributing papers on original research carried out at the laboratory. She chaired the Forensic Science Society question document group meetings throughout the 80s and 90s. And in 1999, she was appointed chair for the question documents discipline at the 15th triennial meeting of the International Association of Forensic Sciences in LA in the USA. She's provided independent expert advice to claimants, defendants, and prosecutors, get this, in thousands of cases, both in the UK and overseas. Who better could we have to come to talk to us about the subject of tonight's lecture? Dr. Giles.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd first like to say thank you very much to the Inner Temple for inviting me to come along and speak to you this evening. I'm also going to make an apology. As you can probably hear, my voice is not in full fettle this evening, having contracted laryngitis last week, but I hope we're going to be able to get through the lecture without problem. It's fortuitous that my guest for this evening, Ellen Radley, who's sitting over here, is a forensic document examiner from a very eminent laboratory, the Radley Document Laboratory. If I collapse, she'll be able to take over and carry on. She'll also be available for questioning later on. I'm particularly happy to have Ellen here this evening because Ellen is the new face of the future of forensic document examination, whereas I shall be actively trying out my retirement in the not too distant future. It'll be Ellen who will be carrying the burden onwards. Anyway, what I want to do this evening is tell you a bit about the scope of forensic document examination, what goes on in a forensic document laboratory, and highlight some areas where you might like to find advice later on. First of all, what is forensic document examination? And I tend to look at this as being three sections which are interrelated. First of all, the identifications of individuals through their handwriting. Now, in general, forensic science is all about trace evidence. Every contact leaves a trace. But in certain of the forensic sciences, the absolute individual is identified. And those are clearly DNA, fingerprints, and the third one is handwriting. So you not only have the evidence, you actually have who did the deed, if the handwriting can be identified. Another very important aspect of my work, probably most time I spend in any one session, is determining whether signatures are genuine or whether they are simulations. And then there's a much larger, complex area which determines the origin and history of documents. So how was a document made, when was it created, how was it created, and what's happened to it since. So if you just consider for the moment, who are forensic document examiners? Who are these people who do these unusual things? For the most part, here in the UK, and forensic science laboratories employ trained scientists. These are individuals who are trained in assessing evidence, and they know about scientific method and objective assessment, usually trained to degree level at the lowest level. I mentioned that most are trained scientists, not all. Some of my colleagues come in from other disciplines. Ellen, who's with us today, was actually a lawyer before she decided to take a change in career and become a forensic document examiner in the Radley Document Laboratory. Forensic document examiners have invested in training. So they are trained alongside experienced forensic scientists. So they've actually worked, before they get into court and start delivering evidence, they've actually worked on case material, probably for a couple of years before they even start looking at their own casework. They will demonstrate continued education, be attending meetings. There are a number of international meetings every year, both in the US and in Europe, and they'll be doing active research, refereeing journals, and they will have their own laboratory facilities. So it's very briefly mentioned the sort of equipment that's in the Giles Document Laboratory. That's basic standard microscopes and specialised equipment for looking at documents under specialised lighting conditions, looking for impressions. I always say, if you really want to test whether you've got the right forensic scientist, offer to hold a conference at their laboratory. If it's not packed full of equipment, journals, and background material, you don't want to know about it. Because what I haven't done here is actually mention the people that you shouldn't instruct as regard to forensic document examination. And this is a very important and rather disappointing area, because besides forensic document examiners who are trained scientists and objective individuals, investigators, there is a sort of parallel universe, which is called graphology. Graphology is a pseudoscience that purports to derive personality features from handwriting. It is absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with forensic document examination as you would find in a forensic document laboratory. It is very unfortunate that there are a number of individuals who have successful careers, it has to be said, actually pretending that graphology gives them sufficient insight to do the work of a forensic document examiner. They are mistaken. I'll leave that point there. I'm sure we can come back to it later. No doubt that Ellen would have plenty to say about it as well. But be very, very careful. Anyway, let's look for the moment at the examination of handwriting. An old science. The principles of examination of handwriting were probably best documented in the early 20th century in the United States by Albert Sherman Osborne, who's sort of the father of forensic handwriting examinations. And they basically carried on in a completely unaltered form to date. So principles haven't really changed, and it's based on the fact that everybody's handwriting consists of a particular combination of character and figure forms, which are developed in young adulthood and then remain more or less consistent throughout adulthood and are reproduced unconsciously without thought. But we don't write the same way every single time we put pen to paper. So the character A may be produced by a single person in several different forms. Similarly, the character E might use 2 or 3 forms, and the handwriting will vary from day to day and over time. In particular, by the time old age sets in, there will be differences both in fluency and execution in handwriting, giving its own problems. That handwriting is identifiable can be easily demonstrated just by using 4 characters. So I've chosen the word huge, and I can look at the number of different ways that I can construct the character H. Quite simple. 3-stroke form, none of the lines connected. 2-stroke form in which the verticals are connected but the crossbar is separate, or a form in which the crossbar and the second vertical are connected, or a form of H in which the pen never leaves the paper and it's continuously drawn. Bringing our character U, a very simple character form. Generally, you divide them into the U ending with a downstroke. I'm trying to find my pointer. And the U without a downstroke. Much more profit from looking at the character G. All sorts of forms can be produced. Oh, am I losing my pointer? But if you go through it, G ending off to the right, G with a downstroke, G with a plateaued section, 2-stroke form, long descending, or curving off to the right with a separate cross stroke, and bring in our character E again. At the top there, you've got the most simple form of block capital E, an L shape with 2 horizontals. Go down one, you've got, again, a fairly common form, but with the bottom horizontal separate, or those of us who write block capital E all in one stroke without the pen leaving the paper. And generally, it's the position of the final stroke which is important in identifying the structure of the characters to how it may join to the next character, either from the top, the middle, or the bottom. But with just 4 single characters, you can actually find a whole combination, which I won't do this exercise tonight, but quite often I make everybody stand up, write down what their huge form is, and then I call out the different forms and get them to sit down, leaving only 1 or 2 standing culprits at the end of the session. Handwriting has been criticised, the examination of handwriting, being largely qualitative and subjective. It is. You can't get beyond that. It's a qualitative, comparative science, and it depends on the examiner making subjective assessments as to what structures are and how significant they are in their occurrence in the population. So quite a lot of effort has been spent over the years in actually trying to mechanise the process. And there has been some success with the electronic recognition of handwritings, a number of projects over the years in Germany, Netherlands, and in the USA. Rather than looking at detailed structure and order of strokes, there's been effort to look at such features as the area covered by, say, the character O, or the angles of some descending strokes. This sort of project's been researched for as long as I've been a forensic scientist. I wouldn't say that it's particularly used in court cases or disputes. It's largely a research tool to look at the variability and the uniqueness of handwritings. But there is some success there, and hopefully in the future even more so. There have been efforts as well to computerize documents so that you can actually handle very large amounts of handwritings to be able to carry out identifications. The examination of signatures, again, mostly goes back, principles set up beginning of the 20th century and largely remain the same today. So what we're looking at with the signature is a very highly specialised piece of handwriting, developed in young adulthood and then reproduced more or less unconsciously from day to day. For most people, the signature is their most used piece of handwriting, so it's the thing that they practice most and use most. In my view, and I think in most forensic document examiners, the area of signature examination is one of the most testing areas of forensic science, and there are very straightforward reasons for that. Whereas if you were examining perhaps handwriting, you may have an entire ledger to look at. You may have hundreds of pieces of handwriting, hundreds of points of comparison to assess and consider. In a signature, you've got that much. That's all. And you've got to make a decision as to whether that is a genuine piece of signature or whether it's had another source. And also, signatures are naturally variable. Nobody writes their signature the same way every single day. So with a natural variation occurring in the signature, it's so important to get the right comparison material. This is comparison science, so we've got our question material and our comparison material. The comparison material is absolutely essential. You've got to have enough of it to be able to establish what the range of variation is, which occurs naturally in that signature, and it's got to be of a good quality. Photocopies are not acceptable. The forensic document examiner really wants to look at the detail of the signature. They haven't got much to go on, so every single feature of that signature is important. So original documents wherever possible, and lots of them. So, as I've said, signatures do vary naturally, and it's a bit of a problem. I would invite you to consider the signature of Mr. Trott here, who certainly never seems to write his signature the same way on every occasion. There are all sorts of variations. You can have, at the end of the signature, sometimes he uses a distinguishable double character T, but in other times just combines it into a design. On occasion, character forms are joined, and in others, they're separate. Sometimes he does it in block capitals. So this is, because of the extent of variation seen, this is in fact a vulnerable signature. Although there's a lot of detail in it, it's vulnerable because it's so difficult to determine whether any differences between any of those signatures are actually just natural variation, or whether they've been introduced by another person producing a simulation. Signatures are subject to external influences. Over the course of my career of some 40-odd years, I've been given all sorts of explanations as to why a question signature doesn't look anything like the genuine signature. And the most common one to date, and I think, is the coffee table explanation, whereas it's not quite the same as all the other signatures you've been given, because he was leaning down on a coffee table while he was signing the document, or on top of a car, or on a clipboard. But no, I wouldn't expect that sort of change in environment to alter the detailed structure, proportions of the pen lines within a signature. It may look different, but the detailed structure should remain consistent. There are times when signatures are altered because of alcohol consumption, not unusual, or drugs, similar changes in actual pen control being altered. This is a case that I did a long time ago, where these two signatures were made on an intoximeter readout in a police station after the arrest of a gentleman in charge of a car. He was taken to the police station, blowed into the intoximeter, and was asked to sign the two sheets that were printed, the two printouts. Very well, all to the good, seemed to be bang to rights, no problems here, went to the court, and Mr. O'Neill denies that he was ever in this police station or he ever produced those signatures. That's his normal form of signature there on the right-hand side, and as you can see, it differs very much from what was produced at the night in the police station. But what he had forgotten, and what, in fact, the station remembered, is that while you're being processed through a police station, for those of you who never encountered this, if you're processed through a police station at any time, you will sign lots of documents relating to property, statements, etc. And we start at the top with the time of his arrest, and these signatures taking progressively during the time when he was being processed to when he woke up on the right-hand side there, to when he woke up in the cell in the morning, considerably more sober, and was left to sign for his property and his bail documents, etc. And we can see that during the time of the intoxication period, that his signature does appear very different, and certainly the alcohol has had a profound effect. So we have a situation here where there are differences, but the differences are explainable. And it's differences between signatures, or differences between handwriting, which are so important. And that's certainly a different approach from the average graphology approach, where they're looking for similarities and ignoring differences. There will always be similarities between two people's handwritings, simply because there are only a finite number of ways in which any character or figure can be produced. It's the differences that the document examiner is interested in. Of course, signatures are the targets of forgery and of simulation. And this is a case that I was involved in many years ago, involving the signatures on wills. We were fortunate to have plenty of comparison material and two signatures which were in dispute here of Leonard Supple. The comparison material was very adequate, more or less consistent signatures over the relevant period of time, no problem there. When we start looking at the question signatures, there are a number of things we can pick out straight away. And the first one is obvious, that these are a lot less fluent than these. A number of line breaks, very poorly executed lines here, tremor, pen lifts where there shouldn't be pen lifts, and also details in the structure of the character forms themselves. You just simply take the character L in the question signature, a simple angular form; in the genuine signature, a loop or a retrace at the angle in every case. The character the character S, beginning at the top here, simple form, open, rounded. In the comparison signature here, beginning with a large loop up from the base and forming a second loop at the base here and onto the next character. The characters F, double F here, are frankly disasters. Obviously, I hadn't really seen what was happening here, because here you've got nice, fluent, repetitive, continuous pen lines. I don't really know what was being produced here, but lots of breaks, not really the same structure at all. Differences in proportion of the LE here at the end of the signatures. So what we've got in these signatures is a superficial similarity, but substantial difference in fluency and detail. And that's basically how you define a simulated signature. Signatures can be much more difficult than that, sometimes even producing just a squiggle. But if you're lucky, it may be just a squiggle, but you can have plenty of signatures for examination, lots of comparison signatures, and a number of question signatures as well, which will allow the document examiners to establish a pattern. In this one, although it's very simple, the entry point of the signatures is substantially different, being from the right-hand side here in the question signatures, but over there in the comparison signatures, the signature actually begins with a small tick at the base, which is a complete difference, allowing you to set the signatures into two populations. These days now we have equipment which allows us to take fine measurements and make comparisons of signatures. The simplicity of signatures can be overcome. In this case, again, we got a very simple signature at the top there, and breaking it down into some of its components. In this particular instance, I'm looking at the proportions of the downward stroke and upward stroke of the signature. I'm quite lucky in this case that I've got a good number of comparison signatures, although they do fall into two distinct groups, with a later group of comparison signatures and a much more recent group. However, making those measurements using specialised equipment and then comparing them doesn't actually help me here, not in these particular measurements. The proportions are more or less same for the three groups. But if I choose to look at another feature, just the length of the downward stroke of the signature, our population starts separate. So the earlier undisputed group of signatures form one population. Our later undisputed signatures form a second population with some overlap, but not a great deal. And our question signatures nicely slotting in here, taking the same form as the late undisputed signatures. And just another component we're looking at here of the angle of the loop of the signature again. Two populations, the early and the later group of signatures, and the question signatures here, although there are a lot less of them, actually corresponding to the late undisputed signatures. So we've now got information both about the genuineness of the signature and also at what stage these documents may have been signed. And that's another important take-home message, because your comparison material not only has to be plentiful, of good quality, but it needs to be from the relevant period. There's really not much help in providing comparison material which is 10 years different from when the document was signed. There will be variation over the years. Sorry, excuse me. The signatures of elderly and infirm individuals are a particular problem, not least because such signatures are often fairly poorly executed and will contain details that you might expect to see in a simulated signature, such as unusual breaks or poor line quality. In this case, we have a situation where there's a patient in a hospital, very ill, lying in bed with a chest drain in, surrounded by family who want him to sign his will. And there's no doubt probably that this gentleman actually really wanted to produce his will and make his bequests, but he was very, very weak and in difficulty in actually making the physical effort to sign the document. And there was a lot of information for the forensic document examiners, who were myself and, in fact, Robert Radley at the time, as to how the signature had been executed. And it was clearly said that because the patient or the gentleman was trembling, his arm was held to help him guide his signature onto the paper. Very important piece of information. So we were provided with a number of comparison signatures. In this case, the comparison signatures provided were actually pretty poor. Not very many, some of them much earlier than the actual time that the will was signed. There was only one from a year or so before. But even looking at those four very poor examples, it is clear that the question signature is really not very much like the comparison or the genuine signatures that were normally signed by this individual. And the question is then, okay, so is this a case that actually guiding the hand has produced the differences? And you can more or less say that if it's a matter of merely steadying the hand or steadying the arm, you'd expect a signature to be reproduced, which is more or less of the form of the normal signature of that individual. But if a stronger influence is exerted, so that the guiding hand actually takes control of the signature and actually moves the hand with the pen in it, then what you're going to get is the guider's hand signature, or a version of a much more awkward signature, but not one that really looks that close to the original genuine signature. Now, in this case, it doesn't look like anything like the genuine signature, so we're sceptical at this stage as to how far any guiding hand must have been involved. And in fact, we go back to that point. They were guiding the hand, or they were steadying the hand because it was shaking. But there isn't any evidence whatsoever of anything shaky about this signature. In fact, it's got some quite nice, fluent, continuous pen lines. So it doesn't fit any of the bills, really. And the conclusion that was drawn in the end was, in spite of the willingness of the testator to put the signature on the paper, it was just simply not possible. And what they did was they took the will outside and actually added one in the form that they thought might get away with. I mentioned earlier, and it's mentioned before, about using instrumentation to detect simulations. This is just a picture of our video spectral comparator, which is the workhorse of the forensic document examination laboratory. It's an instrument which allows documents to be looked at under different lighting conditions, essentially, which allow you to see features of the documents which you just can't see to the unaided eye. So combined with this and microscopic examinations, you can look at documents in different ways. It's not uncommon for signatures to be transposed onto documents via tracing impressions of signatures. So you simply take the document where you want a signature to appear with a document where a genuine signature is present, place the genuine signature on top of the document where you want it to be, write over it with a ballpoint pen so the impressions come through to the next level, and then take them away and ink them in. It's generally not that successful, and I think most forensic document examiners would agree it's probably the easiest sort of simulation you're ever going to get to detect. And looking at it here in obliquely directed light, so at a shallow angle, the impressions are clearly visible. In these days, of course, we have electronic signatures and electronic documents which are bringing a whole different facet into the profession. So here we've got two signatures appearing on a document, and in fact, those are the same signature. All I've done with the bottom signature is stretched it out a bit. So actually, I've taken an image of that electronically, stretched it out and stuck it on another document. When I get the microscope out and look down it and look at the detail of the pen line, of course, they're not pen lines at all. That's an inkjet printing of a signature. And tracing of signatures is still not uncommon. It's been used for many, many years, but still appears from time to time today. This is an interesting case. It involves the National Archives at Kew, where a certain author a number of years ago was researching the theory that Himmler didn't commit suicide while in British custody, but in fact was murdered by the Special Operations Executive. He was very keen to pursue this theory and went along to Kew and looked at got all the files out and studied the document, was absolutely delighted to find what appeared to be several letters written from Brendan Bracken, who was Churchill's Minister of Information and a very close ally in the Churchill government, to the chief of the Special Ops, Viscount Count Selborne, who was known as Top. And these documents implicated the SOE in a cover-up of the apparent murder of Himmler. And the National Archives were absolutely brilliant. They brought them all along to the Giles Document Laboratory, and we were able to have a good look at them using the equipment that I've mentioned. And just looking at them in infrared light, we can see that underneath those fountain pen strokes are actually pencil markings. So he's actually mocked the documents up, put them in pencil, and then inked them over. And there were several of these documents in the files in the archive. There were one or two other anomalies. There were some strange typewritings which shouldn't have matched across documents, and also a stamp impression which had been put on with a laser printer, which really wasn't very helpful to the theory. Interesting to the National Archives, who had for many years been very worried about people taking documents out of the laboratory, out of the archives, and now began to be very worried about people putting them in there. So just leaving signatures, we can go over to the origin and history of documents. Looking at things like inks, pen lines, printing and paper. In fact, I'm not going to talk about paper at all tonight because it's a highly specialised area and you really need to have paper specialists if you're going to be looking at the origin of paper. But inks can be differentiated. There are lots and lots of different black ballpoint pens on the market, and to the unaided eye, they look more or less the same. But if we actually get down and look at them under different lighting regimes, we can see that they actually have different chemical compositions. So this is actually looking at the document under conditions where, which promote fluorescence in inks, and we can see that a very important sentence has actually been added to the document. Just a quick look at a number of blue ballpoint inks of various types, and again, looking at those under different lighting conditions, differences in inks can be easily detected. So where you can see differences in inks on a document, that means more than one pen was used. Where the inks are all similar, you can't detect any difference. That does not mean the same thing. It's an inconclusive finding. It's just that you can't tell that they're different. And there are further modes of investigation that can be used, but which are destructive in nature. The joy of the video spectral comparison using optical methods is they don't damage or alter the document in any way whatsoever. Of course, when you get down to separating the dies of documents, we're digging holes in the document. You can take it a different level there and look at the fluorescence aspects. Now, apart from signatures, one of the most asked questions in forensic document examination is not just who signed it, but when they signed it. And this problem of dating documents is an extremely difficult one. There has been some progress made in looking at volatile components of ballpoint pen inks. This phenyloxyethanol is a component. Once the ball pen is put onto the paper, this element, this chemical in the ballpoint pen ink will start to evaporate. And so the theory is that the more it evaporates, the less there is there. You can speculate that it's been on the paper for a longer period. The big problem is that the time period of the evaporation of this element is really short, and really you've only got inks which are wet over a period of about 3 months that you can actually detect these differences in. Beyond that, simply not possible. And I'd say, although it's one of the most requested examinations, Giles Document Laboratory and I think the Radley Laboratory have not indulged themselves at all with these areas because they are still highly controversial. There are only a few laboratories, mostly in the United States, who carry out this sort of examination. The science is highly contested and very difficult. So at the moment, we don't really have a future for that. There are occasions, though, when you can look just at the ink lines themselves. Ballpoint pen ink lines are not solid ink lines. As the ball moves along on the paper, dragging the ink from the reservoir, it gathers bits of dust and debris, and the ink is actually scraped off the ball, leaving these white gaps in the pen line. And the pattern of the striations, as we call, will remain consistent while the pen is in the same orientation in the hand. So the fact that on the 1st of March and the 19th of March, the pen lines look exactly the same with regard to the striations would actually give any forensic document examiner pause to think about how that might have happened. Here we've got another set of pen lines with an even more distinctive pattern, but dated on the 9th and 13th of March in a diary, which seems to be highly unlikely. I'm actually going to go on one step here and look at sequencing of pen lines and laser printing. So it's not unknown for people who are in a lot of hurry, very busy, to sign a pile of letterheads and leave them behind to be used while they're off on a business trip or maybe sunning in the Caribbean, so that the documents can be used and business can continue. So what happens is the signature's there on a blank piece of paper and anything can be printed on top of it. So it's important to be able to establish what the sequence of the printing and the pen line are. Now, I've mentioned ballpoint pennings. This only really works with ballpoint pens. But ballpoint penning is an oily paste. It's not a fluid ink such as you get in other sorts of pens, a fountain pen. And if you actually look down the microscope at an intersection of a pen line and laser printing, and you look directly down with the light vertically down on top of that intersection, you get back spatter of the light, and you can actually see the oily deposit of the ink sitting there on top of the laser printing. Very useful examination. It's possible to compare documents as to what the printing might actually look like. Here we've got on the left there a very solid, heavy deposit of laser printing, whereas a much more diffuse printing with the individual splatters of the toner visible on the right there. Inkjet printers are ubiquitous. We all have them in our home offices these days. And they can produce also a very distinctive pattern of printing. So we've got document A, pages 1 and 2. We can see more or less the same sort of deposit of the ink dots, which have been fired out from the printer head as it moves across the paper. But then we're provided with document B, which the pattern looks different on page 1 here as can page 2. So in page 1 here, what we're seeing is a lot of white lines going through the printing. Those are blocked nozzles, so they're not actually delivering ink as the head is moving across the paper. So on page 1, the printer's not delivering the ink in a consistent manner, but on page 2 there's no difference here between document A at all. You can't just say on its own that's conclusive, but it's certainly something that needs to be looked at. We're all aware that there are different typefaces produced in different word processor packages, and some of them have very subtle, small differences which need close looking at under the microscope. And another thing we can look at is the dating of typeface. It's often suggested to me that this is fairly straightforward and that, what's the latest development in typefaces? Surely there's something new that we can identify as a recent introduction. But in fact, it's not that straightforward. You've got the Courier typeface there, which is very distinctive, was commonly found in documents in the 1980s. In 1992, Microsoft introduced Times New Roman into its word packaging, its word processing packages. Very distinctive typeface. If you find Times New Roman on a document before 1992, there's definitely something to look at further. Arial was produced as a sans serif type style at the same time, and probably one of the most significant introductions when Microsoft decided to abandon Times New Roman and introduce Calibri. This happened in 2007, and there have been quite a number of cases where the presence of a Calibri typeface in a document has been instrumental in identifying it as a document, a suspicious document. It's slightly complicated in that when these introductions are made, and particularly with Calibri, the manufacturers don't tend to introduce it all at one go. So there may be, prior to 2007, maybe in early 2006, beta packages which are available to certain areas, certain clientele, which will have the Calibri typeface in. So, whereas a document bearing a Calibri typeface with a date of 2000 is definitely suspect. If the dates are much closer, you've got to be very, very careful with your interpretation of the information. Now, is this going to... I don't think this is going to... The ESDA equipment has been mentioned very briefly in the introduction. When I was a very young forensic scientist, and I first went to work at the Meshpoint Police Forensic Science Laboratory, my job was to sit in a dark room with a pencil oblique light and work out what impressions might be found on any sort of document. If you have a notepad and you write on page 1, the impressions of all that writing will come through on page 2 and on page 3 and on page 4. And as a young forensic scientist, it was inevitably down to me to sit in the dark room for hours on end and peer at these impressions and work out what they were. And then a miracle happened. Down in the London College of Printing, a young group of scientists were actually trying to look at fingerprints on cloth. They were trying to develop fingerprints on cloth, and they were having no success whatsoever. But they did notice that in these electrostatic techniques they were using, they were actually visualizing impressions of handwritings. So here's your standard demand note. On a piece of scrappy paper torn from a notepad, and a suspect premises is searched, and lo and behold, there is a notepad with a mundane shopping list on, and it's swept off to the forensic science laboratory as soon as possible, and it's treated to this electrostatic detection, which is a process by which the impressions are developed electrostatically on a film which is overlying our document. So we're looking at the shopping list now. We're looking at it using this electrostatic technique, and what we can do is develop the impressions of all of the handwriting from the page above, which just happens to be our demand note. And that, at that time, it absolutely revolutionised forensic document examination. Any document coming into a forensic document laboratory, a proper forensic document laboratory, will inevitably be subject to ESDA before anything else happens to it, because it's always a good thing to have a look and see what other sort of information you can pick up from a document. And addresses, dates, all sorts of things can be visualised in this way. For anybody who's got a document that's suspect, there are, however, some very important things to remember. The first thing is that fresh fingerprints destroy impressions, so please don't pick the document up, rub your hand over it, hand it round the desk, point on things on it. And the other thing is, whatever you do, don't write on top of it. Put it in a box and send it to the forensic document laboratory. Well, I hope that in the time I've had available, I've been able to take you through a bit of the work that carries on in forensic document laboratories and some ideas and questions that you might ask of documents that come into your possession in the future. And again, thank you very much for listening.
Audrey, that was magnificent. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know whether your voice is up to taking a few questions.
Well, if it's not, I'll make Helen answer.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, your chance to put questions to Dr. Giles, if there are any that occur.
Good evening. I'm over here.
Hello. Hello there.
My name's Munawar. One of the questions I have is, how do you... So there are techniques for removing writing off a page, soaking them in solutions.
Sorry, could you... sorry.
There are ways of removing writing from a page by soaking them in solutions, which is what used to be done on tax discs back in the 90s.
That's right, yeah.
So I'm not going to say what they were, but are you able to tell when information has been removed from a page, just as well as you're able to tell in this method that you've used over here? Are they similar methods of detecting what was once or what was never there?
Yes, yes. I mean, that's generally fairly straightforward. I mean, once you've actually put a chemical on the paper in the form of ink, even though you might try and wash it out or erase it, there will be traces left behind. And using the equipment in the laboratory, you're able to detect those traces and with a bit of work actually put them together and work out what was there.
Thank you.
Yes, halfway down.
Hello. As signatures are more digital moving forward, is it possible to analyse them in the same way that you can do it with a pen on paper? Or have you had any cases of that, and is there potential to do it in the future?
Yes, I think increasingly digital signatures are provided for examination. The same principles exist about looking at shape, structure and proportions, but where you've got a digital signature, you've lost information as to pen pressure, order of strokes. I think in the future it will perhaps become more difficult. I don't know what you think, Ellen, whether digital signatures are providing a much more difficult, a much more challenging environment now for the forensic document examiner.
I think they definitely are, because particularly when you have documents, for an example, a will, and you want to make up a will, leaving everything to yourself, you could simulate a signature. However, it's likely to be detected as such by any half-decent forensic document examiner, or you can transpose a genuine signature onto the document, get rid of the original, and if that goes to an examiner, they'll look at the signature. It may well be found that it is a genuine signature, but it always comes back to the fact that a genuine signature doesn't necessarily mean that the document as a whole is genuine. It doesn't mean that a pen and ink signature was ever appended to that document in that format. And certainly we've been finding that people are realising that with the help of things like CSI and, in fact, Silent Witness, who the forensic pathologists seem to have taken up forensic document examination now. People are more aware and they are choosing it as another method. However, often people do have a suspected genuine master signature that has been used. And as Dr. Giles said, nobody writes signs identically twice on numerous occasions. So if you have an identical signature on another document, that one is in pen and ink, then there's going to be something seriously wrong with a copy document that you're examining.
Thanks. I hate CSI. Everybody says, oh, well, I was watching CSI. I'm sure you can do that.
Last question. Yes.
Hello, thanks very much. Your work is absolutely fascinating. I was just thinking about one particular issue that is relevant potentially in my situation, which is, are you able to detect differences in signatures written by the same person in different alphabets of the same language?
Essentially, in any handwriting or signature comparison, you have to compare like with like. So you compare the character A in your question material with the character A in your comparison material. You can't, although some graphologists, I understand, are able to do this, you can't actually compare different character forms, no.
Audrey, thank you very, very much. Before you go, one very curious thing. I don't know whether this happened to anybody else in the room. When you were describing the different ways in which you could write the letters in huge, I was trying to visualize how I did it. And I bet all of you were. And the curious thing was I couldn't. I had to write them down. And only then did I see how I made the letter H. I just couldn't see it in my mind. Has that ever played any part in what you do?
Well, I think this is the unconscious reproduction. You don't think about how you write it at all.
No.
So natural handwriting is literally that, and contrived handwriting then, becomes obviously different.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I told you it would be fascinating, and it really has been. Thank you very much indeed, Audrey. Our last question of this evening is one of our new academic fellows, and I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes on this. Inner Temple, for some years, has been binding itself closer to the world of academe, because we think there's lots of room these days for a holistic approach to be taken to legal education training. What we do is we have a panel of mixed academic fellows, benchers, and barristers who receive applications. This year there were 38, and the panel selects the top 4 from the 38, and we then invite them to become our academic fellows for 3 years. And it's been a prodigiously successful program. This year, our 4 are prodigiously talented. Let me just give you an idea. We have, in no particular order, Dr. Russell Buchan. He's a senior lecturer in international law at the University of Sheffield School of Law. He's published extensively on the topics of international humanitarian law, cyber law, and international political and legal theory. He's published 2 sole-authored monographs. The first one's entitled International Law and the Construction of the Liberal Peace, and it won the American Society of International Law's Francis Lieber Prize for an outstanding monograph in the field of armed conflict for 2014. The second monograph, it sounds like the sort of thing you need to have as reading material at night, is entitled Cyber Espionage and International Law. He's presented research at various institutions and also to the Council of Europe, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence. He's a co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Humanitarian Legal Studies, and he also sits on the editorial board of the Journal of the Use of Force in International Law and the International Community Law Review. I'm not reading out everything here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just trying to highlight some of the most extraordinarily dashing achievements. Then we have Dr. Efer Daily, who's senior lecturer at the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool, deputy director of the European Children's Rights Unit. She's worked and researched widely on human rights, specializing in children's rights, and has held several NGO and academic positions, for example, with Amnesty International and the University of Essex. Efer researches human rights law through the lenses of social justice, gender, and psychology. She led a 2018 UK Equality and Human Rights Commission project examining good practice examples of how to make UN human rights law a reality. She's also published a monograph on children's freedom of assembly and association. She's recently published Children, Autonomy and the Courts Beyond the Right to be Heard, arguing that as autonomy is highly prioritized in liberal democracies, children's autonomy should be a greater priority when courts determine their best interests. She's at present conducting research funded by the Independent Social Research Foundation, working on a project considering children's competence in various areas of the law, and in 2020 she'll also work with Swedish colleagues on a Söderberg Institute-funded project comparing children's rights in Sweden, about which we've heard quite a lot recently, and the UK, and she's also worked directly with children and young people, engaging, for example, with youth parliaments and teaching human rights through art. Then we have Dr. Davor Jancic. He's senior lecturer at the Department of Law at Queen Mary University, has taught EU law, global law and governance, elements of contract law and public law. Before leaving Queen Mary, he was senior researcher in EU law at the TMC Asser Institute in The Hague and a British Academy Newton Fellow at the Law Department of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also been assistant professor at Utrecht University, where he taught courses in constitutional European and human rights law. He holds a PhD in European constitutional law from Utrecht University, and his doctorate analyzed the role of national parliaments in EU decision-making. He obtained his LLM in international and European law cum laude from the University of Amsterdam, and his Bachelor of Laws summa cum laude from the University of Novi Sad. He's a visiting scholar at Renmin University of China Law School, School of Leadership at the University of Johannesburg, the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Lisbon. This is all making me feel really small, I can tell you. The LSE Law Department and the Center for European Studies of Sciences at Po Paris. He won the Teacher of the Year Award at Queen Mary University in 2018, among many other awards, which I should move away from in order to introduce my fourth, who's Dr. Hannah Quirk. She's Reader in Criminal Law at King's College London. She was a senior researcher at the Legal Services Research Centre. Her research interests developed her previous work as a case review manager at the Criminal Cases Review Commission, investigating claims of wrongful conviction and sentence. In 2005, she spent 6 months on a research sabbatical at the Innocence Project at New Orleans. Before joining the law school at the University of Manchester, she was a visiting scholar at the University of Melbourne and Queen's University Belfast and Fordham University Law School. She's on the editorial boards of the Criminal Law Review and Legal Studies, and she appears regularly in the media discussing aspects of criminal justice and is hosting a series of talks with the attorneys from the Netflix documentaries Making a Murderer and The Staircase. So they do get the right information, these people, sometimes, although, speaking personally, I cannot watch legal dramas on the television. She is a trustee of Transform Justice and the Sentencing Academy, and there is much, much more impressive material like that. So those are our four. We are delighted to have you, ladies and gentlemen, sitting in the front row. Can we all raise a hand to them and say well done and welcome? Thank you very much. Well, that concludes this evening's entertainment in here, but there is more entertainment going on down with drinks downstairs. Thank you very much.